Basically.
Are you going to do you want to start? Or?
Yeah. But we need to wait for 3.
Oh, yeah, no, but I mean to the people here.
Now.
Like this minute.
Let's give it a minute or 2.
Yeah. Wait, isn't it? Well, no.
Is anyone going to come in to this call? Is my real question.
And I don't know how you're going to know if they do, is what I wonder.
We come in very late.
I would, yeah, they can come in early, do they? No. It's like there's always that moment. It's like it's no, and anyone going to come to my party?
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
Who's going to come?
I'm surprised that there aren't some people.
Well, exactly. That's my fear. That why aren't they
But
there?
I wonder if we should say something to the room anyway. Oh, here we go.
Oh,
We've got. Oh, yeah. Okay.
new lobby. Oh, they're coming in.
Hey, do you remember Simon? You two have probably met. We probably met each other years ago.
That's good news. That's good
Okay.
news.
Oh, yes.
I've admitted 2.
Okay, there's another one. Oh, but we should probably, if they're in, they can see all of this, can they?
It's okay.
We'd be saying something like,
Don't
welcome.
worry, just let's not say anything till 3. We're nearly 3. I'll never say something.
They're so unprepared.
No, it's fine. Mute everyone.
Just unmute it. There we go.
There'll be a fair.
I can't see who's there.
Oh, I can't either.
So stressful.
We're letting people in, but we're not talking to them. So it's the least welcoming webinar. Got 7 people.
Now I don't know where they've gone. People. See all.
I don't know if people can. Yeah, they can. We see it better on that one. I don't know if they can hear us.
They're waiting to join.
Okay. Can you get them from that one?
I've just admitted a few more.
Okay. Bear with us on screen. We're just letting more and more people in.
Something on this laptop competes it. Oh, so it can see that.
Yeah.
Okay, we should start.
We should start.
Yeah, and I'll just let people in.
301.
Yeah, I'll let people in.
Okay, cool. Welcome everybody. Welcome. Lovely to see you. Bear with us. We're doing a hybrid event here. We've never done this before, so whether the technology will work for us or not, who knows? But we're crossing fingers. So welcome to all of you here in the room, and welcome to people as they're coming in from all over the world. So we have 40 people registered from all over the world, and I should not destroy the table before we start. But I really want to say I'm delighted to be here again. We were here 10 years ago. It was our 15th anniversary of Talent Innovations. For those of you who don't know Talent Innovations, we do 360 feedback. We love 360 feedback, so you can imagine how delighted I was to hear that Kaz was going to do her doctorate on that exact topic. It was just perfect. So I've really enjoyed observing her pain from the distance, learning her insights as well. So I'm supremely happy to hear all about it. Because what I've heard, it's really useful stuff, really useful, and will help us have every 360 intervention land with impact, positive impact you know, to generate insights and to deal with what people have to deal with. It's super interesting stuff. I think you'll love it. So it's really over to you, Kaz. I am recording it. If anyone's got a problem with that, now's the time to say, or let me know afterwards. But I'll carry on recording it for the moment.
Can I just check with people on screen that you can hear us?
Does anybody?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Excellent.
Oh, thanks.
I'm going to move out.
Thanks. So as you can see, we've got people in the room as well, and hopefully you get a sense of the people in the room. And can you see my screen as well on Teams? Can people see my screen?
Yes,
Yeah,
it's projecting.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Like as in a full screen, not on some weird setting.
That's right. At
Okay,
least for
perfect.
me.
Okay, great.
you.
And in the room too. And in the room too. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Alva, I guess I was curious to know a little bit more though. Obviously, this is your 25-year anniversary. So we were hoping to share just some reflections then on those 25 years, as well as reflections from my research. So I don't know if you want to position.
Well, I
briefly.
was just reflecting as I was on my way here. I was like, what was I doing 25 years ago? What was I thinking? And what was I doing? And what was 360 doing then? 360 had been around a little while, but very few people were comfortable with it 25 years ago. And the conversations we were having was, well, why should I ask other people what they think? My boss tells me from time to time that's enough. So that was the state of interest and consciousness at that time. So that's the starting point. Now people do seem to understand there is some value in seeing other people's views. And we are in the house of someone who really understands about these things, the hidden stuff that we don't necessarily, we're not always conscious of. And now we're able to address how best for it to land, how to make long-term positive impact for people. And, you know, we're in a different place now. And now we're integrating AI, other things like this. So it's really moved on a lot. And I still love 360. And I could still talk forever, but I'm not going to, because that's over you, Kaz.
And you do 360 with amazing
360
people,
with these
I guess, would be
yes,
an
I'm
important.
very happy to welcome some of these folks online with us today. We do a lot of work with universities and United Nations these days. Yeah.
No, so I want to say a big thank you, Alva, because you give me amazing opportunities to work with incredible people basically around the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've still got people entering here, haven't we? But I'm just going to get on with this then. So my research interest is in psychological defense mechanisms, and it does feel slightly scary to talk about those in the house of Freud because he might be listening. I don't know how accurately I'm going to portray this. I wasn't really sure whether to share kind of the catalyst for this work because it was a really personal experience that led me to become really interested in this area. But Brené Brown talks about dancing with the person that takes you to the party, and so it feels right to tell you about my partner, which was betrayal. The partner that took me to this party is a partner of betrayal. So my own interest was, the catalyst of it was 7 years ago. I had a phone call from a number that I didn't recognise. And the woman on the other end of the phone asked me, was I going on holiday with my husband? I knew instantly that she was having an affair with my husband. And yet, I don't know quite how I knew. I was really completely shocked, but simultaneously not at all surprised. I've pretty much my whole life, as long as I can remember, been really interested in self-awareness. So I used to collect this weekly magazine, Know Yourself, not quite this one, I'm not quite that old. You used to collect it every week and put it in these big ring binders in the late 80s. That was a thing before the internet. And so as this really self-aware, I thought, person, it really kind of struck me. How could it be? How could it have been that I both knew and didn't know? And so I've spent the last 7 years basically exploring that phenomenon. And I came across a brilliant concept called the unthought known, which really helped to explain what had happened in that moment. That I knew at some sort of cellular level, but I couldn't let my brain know it. You know, once I knew it, rather than it being an unthought known, then obviously something had to shift. And what I started to realise in a lot of the fabulous work that I do with Alva in feedback sessions was that I think in feedback settings, quite often what is going on is that the feedback that participants are receiving, they have that same simultaneous sort of knowing and not knowing phenomenon. So this is why I decided to research it. So the literature on self-awareness points to the fact that we should consider this really as a dual construct phenomenon. So there are kind of two aspects of it. One is the internal part of self-awareness. And I think these days when we can measure so much about ourselves via all the metrics available, we can really know a lot, can't we? We can know if a glass of wine keeps me up all night. You know, you can really understand a lot about yourself from this sort of inner world bubble of yours, ours. And then the other concept is more about external than self-awareness. How do I know how I land with other people? What impact I have on others? And of course, in the emotional intelligence literature, that's how self-awareness is really defined, the alignment between how do I see myself and how do others see me? And I think quite often when we work with people, they think that they're really self-aware because they do a lot of that internal stuff. They ruminate a lot on how they are. But of course, unless we let in that external view, what do other people think of us? We're missing a trick. You know, we're missing that aspect of self-awareness, which is what do other people think of me? And this is obviously where 360 is so critical, because the only way to ascertain this aspect of self-awareness is by asking other people. And many people will have probably come across the Johari window model to help explain that a little bit more. So here we've got the axes, you know, self and other. And this model really points to the fact that we want to encourage open communication and more dialogue so that we can expand that arena quadrant. One way of doing that is to disclose more information about yourself. So you know, what's unknown to others but known to us might be conceived as our facade. And so by lowering that facade, then, you know, you've learned more about me already. I've just shared stuff about me. So, you know, then you might have empathy, you know, how the relationship can develop. And then the other way the arena can expand is in this other direction of what do you know about me that I don't know? So blind spot. And I guess what I figured is that it might be helpful, I love the Johari window model, but it might be helpful to include in that a less binary view of known and unknown. So I borrow Christopher Bollas's unthought known concept and pop it into the Johari window to emphasize that known isn't quite as clear cut as this. And it's really my hunch, actually, that it's when an individual receives feedback that is an unthought known, that they get prickly. It's kind of like you've pressed a button for, you know, their button is pressed kind of idea. It's my experience, really, that actually, if it's a complete blind spot, it's like water off a duck's back, you know, that people aren't actually, oh, really? People think of that? I'm surprised, you know. But there's something different that goes on when we're presented with information that we've been keeping really in our peripheral vision. You know, these psychological defense mechanisms are the ways in which we keep out of conscious view bits of ourselves that we don't want to see. And of course, my own experience was really powerful in that. You know, it really opened my eyes to just how powerful these dynamics are. If we don't want to see something, we're really good at not seeing it, basically. And so similarly, I think in feedback contexts, what might go on sometimes is that, yeah, people don't want to hear that aspect of themselves because that's the thing that they've been trying not to face up to. It might mean they need to change something about themselves. And so I became really interested in this because we know in the workplace, of course, you know, loads of money and time is spent on appraisals and giving people feedback. We also know that most people dread it, they dread giving it, they dread receiving it. And lots of the research points to the fact it doesn't work. You know, this meta-analysis, which is a bit old now, but more recent studies find similar things, that essentially it often only leads, feedback interventions often only lead to a small improvement, and sometimes no improvement whatsoever. And so, of course, loads of research is conducted in this area. There's been lots of really sophisticated randomized control trials to explore variables like, when you give the feedback, how specific it is, the source, whether the person appraises themselves, personality differences, what's the point of it, do people get to reflect, and so on. So we know that there are loads of variables that also make a difference. And then there are lots of models that help us think about, how it works. And I really like this model because what it emphasizes is that people need to have their awareness raised during the feedback session in order for that to then lead to meaningful developmental action. So my hunch is that there might be scenarios in which a manager gives feedback to someone and they think, great, I've told them, they've heard this, but the person has got their blinkers up, they've got these unconscious, and their unconscious are outside of awareness for the individual. And so the feedback recipient walks away from the meeting blocking out the key message, and the feedback giver walks away thinking, great, I've told them what they need to hear. And therefore behaviour doesn't change, which is what's backed up by a lot of the studies. So this is what I wanted to explore in my research. And just briefly then, a little bit more on the background then of what these things are, these individual psychological defence mechanisms, first introduced by Freud, and we're sat here in his house. So all of you joining online here, you're kind of here with us too. And he defined them really as these ways in which we unconsciously guard ourselves from excessively anxiety-provoking aspects of reality. Lots of research into these has really shown that there is a developmental path that people have. There's a chronology to different defences. So we can describe them as immature through to more mature, or maladaptive through to more adaptive. So when children are very young, they can have very fantastical, great ways, really brilliant ways of protecting themselves. So, for example, having an imaginary friend. But of course, if you met an adult who said, I'd like to introduce you to my imaginary friend, you'd be a bit suspicious of that, So this idea that these fantastical ways in which we protect ourselves change, we hope, over the kind of maturation period of life. And my wonderful supervisor, an expert in defence mechanisms, Olya, who's here today, uses this fabulous metaphor. I hope I'm getting it right, Olya. She describes like whatever it is that we're trying to protect, is it identity or self-esteem or ego or whatever it is. If we imagine this like a jelly, when we're very young, it's really wobbly. So we need to be really careful in how we protect it. We need a lot of this protection in place because our jellies are so wobbly. And then the hope is that as we age, the jelly solidifies a bit more, it becomes more set, and therefore as we age, the hope is that we don't need to be quite as protective. We can take a few knocks to our ego because we're not so sensitive. So this is what I wanted to explore, as I say, and I had the really fortunate opportunity to explore these defense mechanisms with people who give feedback all the time. So the British Association of Snow Sport Instructor Trainers, so the people who train other people to become snow sport instructors, much of their work is giving feedback to people to help them come on. And I had the, as I say, really fortunate opportunity to work with them and find out, do they see these defence mechanisms then in the feedback conversations they have. It's a really messy area to research because, of course, these are unconscious. So if you were to ask the person, they're likely not to spot them because they're unconscious. So I took the really pragmatic view that I wanted to ask feedback givers what they notice. And so I was interested to explore, well, firstly, do they exist? Are they present? Do these snow sport instructors recognise in feedback conversations that these things are happening? And if so, what do they notice? What are the behavioural manifestations? How are these things expressed? I thought it was also helpful to find out what strategies they use to try and manage them. and also whether there are differences between more and less experienced feedback givers, on the basis that I wondered if it could be the case that if you're really brilliant at giving feedback, might you never set up that the other person is defensive because you're so good at giving the feedback? Because of course it is a dynamic process, feedback giving. So this is what I wanted to understand. And as I say, I took this really pragmatic approach of just asking people about their experiences, had they seen them? The other really tricky thing is that there is no agreed list of defences. There's a book that suggests there's 101 defences. Other researchers suggest looking away is a defence. So narrowing down, well, what are the defences that I'm interested in was a bit tricky. I'd conducted a further study, a systematic literature review, and that helped me to narrow down which ones, also in consultation with Olya, we decided, didn't we, that these 8 were the ones to look at. So just to run through quickly what those 8 are. So denial, which is a mechanism in which a person fails to acknowledge some aspect of external reality that would be apparent to others. Projection is a mechanism in which a person forcefully attributes his or her own unacknowledged feelings, impulses, or thoughts to others. Turning against self is a mechanism in which a person indirectly and unassertively expresses anger towards themselves or passively towards others. Rationalization is a mechanism in which, I can't read it now because it's just popped up, in which so rationalization is an incorrect explanation of someone's behavior. You know, when you make an excuse for it, essentially, like it makes sense to you, but it's, inaccurate. Splitting is where a person views themselves or others as all good or all bad. So a failure to integrate positive and negative qualities of self and others. Acting out is when you just appear to not notice, what the ramifications of how you behave might have on others. Intellectualization is a mechanism in which a person is unable to experience simultaneously cognitive and affective components of the experience. And so essentially, this is also described sometimes as isolation of affect. So it's like you just don't have any feelings, maybe like you're a robot, you're just in your head too much. And the final one was reaction formation. And this is where a person substitutes behaviors, thoughts, or feelings that are diametrically opposed to their actual ones. So a really common example of this is putting on a brave face, or smiling in the face of adversity, where we make a reaction that makes it like, oh yeah, no, that was great, when that's not how you're really feeling. So these were the 8 that I was looking at. I hope that all makes sense, does it? Yeah. I've got a really short clip here, which again, I really hope is going to work online for people. And in this really short clip, I just wanted to bring to life what defensiveness can look like. So for those of you who have watched Paddington, it's Knuckles McGinty, and he's quite a defensive chap, not someone that you might look forward to giving feedback. So in this video clip, I think you get to see 3 different defences, but let's see what you think.
Gentlemen, for breakfast this morning, Chef McGinty would like to propose an orange marmalade served on a bed of warm, crustless bread, topped with another piece of warm, crustless bread. Bon appetit.
2 choices. Take it or leave it.
Are you all right, Knuckles?
Yes.
Well, why don't you come and join the others?
I want to.
Are you scared what they might think?
No.
Who do they think? Did they like us? Did they say anything? What did they say? Well,
They isn't us. I knew it. We thought that I was starting a amount on nothing. And he was right.
Knuckles, Knuckles,
What?
come and look.
strange, warm tingle in my tum-tum. I think that's called pride, Knuckles. I don't like it.
And I guess it does help emphasize as well that these things are more complex than people just having one, there. As I say, I think the splitting in terms of take it or leave it, acting out, and then at the end there was an example of intellectualization where he didn't recognize the feeling in his tum-tum. So what did I find? I found that the snow sport instructors recognised all of the defences, in fact. So in the brackets there is the number of people who felt that they had examples that they could share of times when a feedback recipient had demonstrated what they would consider to be that defence mechanism. And of course, I'd explained to my participants, what these are. I showed them video clips like you've just seen. And so all 20 felt that they had seen examples of rationalization, projection, turning against self, and denial. 19 thought they'd seen examples of splitting, 17 had seen examples of acting out, 16 had seen reaction formation, and only 10 identified having seen intellectualization, which was really interesting to me because in that systematic literature review that I mentioned, in other settings, we find that intellectualization is a really common defense. So it's kind of interesting to me that in that snow sports setting, intellectualization isn't very, prevalent. And what they described to me was that often on those courses, the phrase from Top Gun, just do it, don't think, comes out a lot. And so I think this idea that if we're engaged in an occupation or an activity like snow sports, being someone who would defend themselves through intellectualization would really be at odds, because you really need to be in your body. You can't not know your feelings to be good in those sorts of professions. And actually Olia has written quite a lot around how certain defenses that people have may be linked to their career choices, which I find really fascinating. So yeah, and I think this sort of backs up that idea a bit, doesn't it, that intellectualization wasn't as well found in that context. So it gave me anyhow confidence that maybe this is a thing, maybe defense mechanisms are getting in the way of feedback and that they can be spotted. So people gave me examples and I then categorized those examples into themes, and these are the themes basically. So rationalization, the themes that came out there were around people making excuses. It's the skis, it's the boots, it's the weather, it's all sorts of things why they can't perform. And storytelling was another theme. What was really interesting there was that there was a difference between the more experienced and the less experienced instructors. So the less experienced were more likely to view it as the feedback recipient making excuses, whereas the more experienced feedback givers were just a bit more nuanced in recognizing that those individuals had created a narrative for themselves. So rather than see it like the person was just making an excuse, they saw it much more that this individual has created a narrative that makes sense for them of what's going on. So that was an interesting kind of difference between a more and less experienced feedback giver. That was the only one in which there was a difference between the two perspectives of, and perhaps didn't mention the way in which I explored that was simply to split the group of 20 interviewees into those with the least and those with the most experience. And the least experience all happened to have 10 or less years experience, and all of the more experienced have more than 10 years experience. So I was conscious as I was analysing my data to look out for differences between them. In terms of projection, they recognised this in terms of if someone had feedback and then that being impacted onto the group. So, someone like they're just being a bit quiet, but when you can just feel that in a room, when, someone's unprocessed emotions are being projected into the group. They also recognised it as deflection, so the person becoming angry with them about the very feedback content often that they were trying to give to that person. So saying to them, you need to improve your communication skills, and them saying, I think you need to improve your communication skills. So the thing that can happen with projection, where it becomes, difficult to untangle whose emotions are whose, and also just getting frustrated at other people. Turning against self was really around, people being really frustrated at themselves, being really over self-critical and perfectionist. Good is never good enough. Denial was really interesting because in a snow sports setting, people often video people's performance, and they gave me examples that even in the face of having video evidence, the person would say, no, I did do it. No, you didn't, because look, there's a video of you. And so that bizarre one was people saying, it was like I was in one of these shows where, someone's going to jump out and tell me that I've been in some show in which the real thing isn't happening kind of idea, because it was such a bizarre thing. How can that person's perspective be so very different to the reality? Generally speaking, that one is about people being blind to the obvious. And then again, in this very specific context, some people felt that it wasn't really denial, it was more that people had low proprioception. So because people weren't used to being in their bodies, they just didn't realize that they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. The splitting, and I've just brought out a couple of quotes there just to bring to life, this is the sort of thing that I was then categorizing. So for example, I had an example where someone shared with me, a participant who said, the Canadian system is so good, and this one, it's really just rubbish. So that sort of idea of polarizing, that the British one is rubbish, the Canadian one's great. So polarizing was a theme that came out there, as was giving up. So an example of this was that someone just walked off the course. Acting out often looked like aggression or losing grip on reality, tantrums and complaints. Reaction formation looked like the feedback recipient paying lip service to the feedback, or that the person was just naturally a really positive person, or that it was actually quite constructive for them to say what they think the feedback giver wanted them to say. As I say, intellectualization wasn't identified as frequently, but what this did look like where it was a lack of emotion or overly theoretical in focus. When I asked people to share examples, what I noticed was that the more experienced trainers were more likely to actually share with me a tactic that they used to manage the defence rather than an example of the actual defence. So again, we see there that people who've got more experience in feedback, are doing something different to people with less experience, essentially. And so they shared with me specific tactics to manage these 8 different defences. So things like, calling out people's stories in relation to rationalisation. So when they're saying it's the snow, pointing out it's not the snow. In projection, things like, the self-awareness of the feedback giver themselves, so that they don't take on the learner's projection. So as we were just describing, you can get yourself into some entanglement of emotions. So really recognizing what is mine and what is the other was one of the ways in which people were able to manage that. In terms of turning against self, and I'm just going to read out a few examples rather than all of it. So turning against self, because the person is so self-critical, the best way of handling that was to really give praise and encouragement, really help them to recognize they could have greater self-compassion. When someone is denial, then obviously trying to use the physical evidence, such as videos or tracks in the snow, if you can. Splitting, encouraging people, to be more balanced, basically. With acting out, sometimes people felt that you just need to give people time, you need to just let them vent if that's how they're feeling. The reaction formation, avoid knocking that positivity out of them, but, check that, keep them in check, essentially. And in terms of intellectualization, a tactic might be to call a timeout, encourage the learner to take a breath and recall positive feedback to help them essentially come back into their body. So these were specific tactics that one could use to help overcome these different defenses. And then in terms of more generally managing defensiveness, what people told me seemed to me to boil down into kind of 2 areas. One was around the skills and attitude of the feedback giver. So things like building rapport, creating the right conditions, providing containment, making the person feel safe, reinforcing their commitment to the learner's progress. as well as specific techniques. So linking feedback to someone's goal, agreeing a feedback contract, using multiple sources of feedback, like 360, calling out their excuses, naming the elephant in the room or on the Alps. And it struck me when I was sort of collating those two things that it seemed to be paralleled by a concept in therapy. So the therapeutic alliance, if anyone's ever come across that, is a construct which is seen to be the most important predictor of the outcome of therapy. So regardless of the modality of feedback, the relationship between the therapist and the client is the best predictor of outcome. And that alliance, that relationship, isn't just how well do we get along, the kind of affective aspects, although that is really important. So the bond, the relationship, which is similar to what my instructors, I think, were describing in terms of skills and attitude. The other aspect is this more collaborative aspect, which I think is more like these specific techniques, so that we've got a task to achieve here, you know, that we've got an agreed goal and we're working towards it. So I thought it was helpful to capture that that's sort of similar then to a therapeutic alliance. And then my final findings then were around this idea of advancement of trainers' approach to providing feedback. So again, I'm really interested in this idea of what changes when people get better at giving feedback. And people shared with me that they often encountered much more defensiveness earlier in their careers. You know, that when they were first giving feedback, they'd often get defensiveness, but then especially for these instructors who have many years experience, they rarely encountered it. And they told me, and again, I've summarized these into the things that I thought made sense of it, that essentially that was really all about being more self-aware, being more emotionally intelligent, and their capacity to take a third position. So in terms of being more self-aware, what that looked like was the instructor not taking it personally, showing greater openness themselves and really recognizing their role in the dynamic and being more supportive and empathetic. They'd also become more emotionally intelligent, it would seem, from the way in which they were describing how they went about situations, you know, becoming more adept at reading people and adapting their style more to the individual. And then this final point around a capacity to take a third position. So I'm using the word metacognition, that is not the word they used, but you know, this capability to look in on the dynamic. So if first perspective is from my own point of view, like I'm giving feedback to someone and it's not landing very well and I just want to go home, you know, that would be first perspective. Second perspective might be, you know, I can really understand this individual might feel really disappointed. Second position. And then third position, this sort of helicopter view in which we recognize what I say is going to impact them differently, or how can I best craft it? And someone said, I really like the way they positioned it. These were their words. I'm trying to craft that sort of second layer of emotional understanding where I'm thinking, right, I say certain things, some people, they're going to react in that way. So it's this capability of really recognizing that, you know, we can do more when we're working with people than, you know, just see it from our own perspective and just see it from their perspective, but, you know, recognizing that dynamic in between. So these were the main findings. And to pull it all together, I have created this model. And so my model incorporates what I've renamed Learning Alliance. So this is a construct that I've created, borrowing, as I said, from the Therapeutic Alliance. And what I'm saying is that feedback conversations really need to happen within this context of a learning alliance. And as I mentioned then, so that is about affective aspects of the relationship between the two people. So the bond, the relationship, essentially creating a sense of psychological safety with that person. And then also collaborative aspects. So what are the tasks? What have we agreed in terms of the goals? And so perhaps agreeing a feedback contract and understanding the individual's goals. And I'm reminded in psychodynamic literature how it's spoken about maternal and paternal containment. And of course, they're quite genderist roles, but go with it. You know, that in a sense, what we need to be here is kind of like mum and dad. You know, we need to be like mum. We need to, you know, nurture the person. We need to make them feel safe. And we need to be like dad. You know, what are we doing here? What's the objective? What are we trying to get done? So with all of that in place, all within the same one person that's giving the feedback, then we can move on to my model, which, as I highlighted at the start, is the adaptation to Johari's window, in which I incorporate the unthought known. And then it strikes me that we can imagine psychological defense mechanisms like a padlock that is not visible to the feedback recipient. I don't know my own padlock because it's unconscious, it's invisible to me, but other people can see it. That's what my snow sport instructors showed, they were able to spot it. And then within that padlock, I've highlighted a tiny spring. I don't know how visible that is, but the spring really denotes the individual's appetite, desire to change. I guess it feels too clunky, really, that if a feedback giver becomes the key holder, that any feedback giver can just go in and open someone up. It doesn't work like that, obviously. A person needs to want to change. And just like a lock won't open without a spring, then as an individual going into this, I need to have some appetite for change. So I depict defense mechanisms as this padlock, and as I say, allowing for the fact that the person has to have some desire. And then the feedback giver is positioned as a potential key holder. And so what I really hope my model emphasizes is the co-creative nature of learning. It takes two to know one. We can't know this stuff for ourselves because of this invisible padlock. I can't know as much about myself. In my case, my padlock was obviously smashed open by a phone call from the other woman. And our hope in working with people is that we can help them, come around to understanding more about themselves, their self-awareness, through being a skillful feedback giver. So I then pull it all together, with this framework in which the padlocks might be identifiable to a feedback giver by those sorts of themes. Of course, I did this in a really niche context with snow sport instructors. It wouldn't be the same in all contexts, but hopefully it just brings to a more behavioural level, what are the sorts of things that might be getting in the way of people taking on board feedback? And then as a feedback giver, we might use the keys, those specific techniques or tactics to try and support that learner in being more open to the feedback, basically. So I hope that sort of all fits together. And then I have a final image, which fabulous Julian Burton at Delta 7 Change made for me. He works in visual dialogue. I don't know how much people have come across that, but he works with companies who are trying to come up with strategy, and he draws it as they're talking. When you're trying to convey concepts that are quite complex, it can be quite helpful to have a picture. And so again, just by way of kind of pulling it all together there, they're sat on a carpet of the Learning Alliance. So remembering all of those contextual parts of making the feedback conversation helpful. And then we need to look at both the kind of content of the conversation as well as the more relational aspects. This stuff is subtle dynamics that we're talking about. And so, we might go into a feedback conversation anticipating that the person is likely to feel anxious, that they have got their own jelly, whatever that looks like. It's a box in this picture, but, they've got their jelly that they're looking to protect, and their own intrapersonal stuff going on. And we've got our own intrapersonal stuff, and we're looking at the interpersonal that's going on between us. And yeah, my hope is that by making these defences more aware, at both an individual and like an intrapersonal level, like I might start to spot more of my own defences. It can help me to become more self-aware. And also interpersonally, if I can support colleagues and people I work with so that they can become more self-aware because I can see something in them that they can't see for themselves, essentially. And there we are. That is what I've spent the last little while. Oh, thank you. So we've got times. Exactly.
Any observations? Have you noticed these 8? Do you recognise these 8 different mechanisms? Defence mechanisms? Any observations, anyone?
Well, I'm interested in what actually you observed, when giving 360 feedback, what you might have observed yourself, and you've kind of got this strong kind of vision or view of it, so I think back on whether it's beginning, it's changed, if you've done research, whether your observations and approach have changed.
Yeah, I've definitely become much, much more confident in working with those subtle dynamics. It often feels really palpable to me, actually, when a person is being defensive, and I really know that they don't realize that they are being. And so I'm on a learning curve really of trying to find ways, just try and loosen the edges a little bit, or just try and get in somehow of, helping people, just loosen up the narrative that they've created. I think we're all so powerful at creating a story that makes sense of our experience for ourselves. And people will often, the leaders I work with, they'll often have a really bulletproof story of themselves. This is how I am. And so that's really interesting, because then they've got some colleagues who are telling them that that's different. And so just navigating, just holding it very loosely with lots of curiosity about, it's really interesting because I understand that you see yourself like this. And yet we also hear that it doesn't always land quite the way that I think you think it's landing, because look, these people are saying this. So I think just feeling more confident to try and explore some of these sort of more grey areas, but, in that real learning alliance sort of way, I think it's all about safety. It's understandable that we are protective of our self-concept, identity, whatever it is. And so I think really just trying to create a space that feels really, really safe for people to explore it for themselves is, I hope what is emphasised as well through my work. Thanks, Trish. I don't know if anyone online, but I have no way of really being able to.
No, we've got no way.
Which is the least welcoming. Maybe I can. I don't know. Maybe I
They
can.
can speak, I suppose.
Yes, you can. Look, I see. If anyone online has a question, please do just come off of mute.
Hi, Caroline, this is Eric. Thanks. It was great. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering, you talk a lot about obviously the perception of this ski teacher, the way they feel all these locks were there. I was wondering also, once they sort of identify those locks, I mean, in terms of the also other possible benefits for the people they were training. I mean, did they see, for example, that afterwards it was easier to train sometimes the people participating in these I guess training sessions, ski training session, or I don't know, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So of course they didn't have my keys and the locks at the time because I was just asking them.
Of course.
But undoubtedly, what really came across exactly as I've just conveyed, this idea of the importance of the quality of the relationship. So things that they would describe would be things like recognizing how important it is to use like the ski lift conversation, just to get to know the person a bit more, or, really build that connection. They really recognized that spending a lot more time up front with groups, creating rapport, creating trust, paid dividends in the longer run. And so what they realized was that earlier in their career, they'd be much more task orientated. Let's just get on, and you've got to learn this and you've got to learn that. And what they recognized, as they had more experience, was that actually it's the conditions that you create, from off the bat, really creating great conditions that enables then people not to feel defensive over the duration of the course. So I think just trusting much more that those relationship aspects are the work to be done almost.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Great. Yeah, no, absolutely. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else online or in the room?
There are 37 people there.
I know.
Question, Kat. So Neil and I have got an objective, sort of shared objective next year, something that we work at to build more of a feedback culture. And we define quite what that is.
That's good.
Yeah. But do you think environment where people are much more comfortable giving and receiving feedback? I wonder, from a organisational culture perspective, what the implications of the research might be for helping to move in that direction.
Good question.
So again, it comes back to this sort of relationship aspect, doesn't it? I mean, I guess that ideally we create cultures in which people, feel they can be human. In fact, Chris, I really liked a comment that you made on a podcast about the fact that quite often what happens, it seems, when people cross the security line, the boundary of the organisation, is that they just lose sort of human skills that they had outside of the organisation. I hope I'm not misquoting you there, but this idea that, outside of work, we might be perfectly great at giving feedback. You give me the wrong change in a shop and I say, oh, you give me the wrong change. And yeah, somehow or another, we go into the workplace and we lose some of these human skills that we do have, but they're not being accessed within that sort of more hierarchical structure, potentially, of the organisation and so forth. I think so I would love to partner with an organisation, to bring about more of a feedback culture. And one of the things that I would do, I think, is change the name of it. So I have a real peeve around the expression feedback, which is, of course, an engineering concept. My brother's an engineer and loves to point out how much of psychology is borrowing from engineering, so stress, resilience, all sorts of things. And connection is probably an engineering term too, but that's the one that I would choose. I think feedback has, in my head, this sort of inherent rationality, a bit like your thermostat in your house, that if the room's too cold, the heating kicks in. And it's like, if I give you feedback, you're just going to do that rational thing that I've asked you to do. Whereas I think connection allows for something that's more two-way, and I guess that is what I would encourage organisational cultures to consider, how possible is it for us to really have open conversations in which we can both grow? That needs to have a trust as a basis, doesn't it? That I want you to be the best version of you that you can be. And therefore, I'm offering this connection conversation rather than feedback as a way in which, we can both get better. And I guess so I think it's around, shifting the emphasis from feedback, to something that has a more connected and more two-way and more in the spirit of, we all want to be the best versions, and we can't do this stuff alone. We really cannot be the best versions of ourselves without other people inputting to it. Because, like I say, it takes two to know one. I can ruminate in my own bubble as long as I like, but I'm never going to know how I land with other people without asking them.
Yep.
So it's creating conditions, I think, in which we all sign up and agree to, just wanting to support one another.
I love that language of talking about connections rather than your feedback. And I think within the 360 world that many of us in this room live in, we're not really feedback givers, we're facilitators other people's feedback.
Absolutely.
What I've noticed, and I'm hoping that you equip me with some new keys from this, is that on occasions, and I had one quite recently, I get hooked in to their process.
Yeah.
So I've had somebody super intellectualizing and rationalizing the feedback that somebody else has given them, and I'm facilitating it, and I'm now hooked in. And I find myself trying to re-rationalize, to beat them at their rationalization. and then, really. So I think
Story builds and things.
that's until it's a disaster.
Yeah.
Not what we're trying to achieve. Luckily, it doesn't happen very often. But I wonder what the psychodynamic feedback loop is with the feedback giver or the facilitator in your model, and how there's two Johari windows going on, aren't there?
Yes.
There's one in my head and one out there somewhere.
Yeah. And so I guess the dynamic that you're really describing is that projection one that I was saying about, and how, so projection is this idea that, emotions are contagious, that we can get really hooked in, can't we? And so I think that capacity of self-awareness, really recognizing what is mine and what is someone else's, so that we don't get hooked into their rationalization. Again, it's that third perspective, recognizing, oh, this individual, the way in which they seem to be interpreting this data is to rationalize it a lot. And so hold that as data. This is how that person is processing that information, and try and make that more object to them. Recognize, it's really interesting, in response to this, you seem to have a really good narrative going on there. You understand, I don't know, I can't say it off the top of my head, but that kind of just trying to understand the dynamic rather than getting sucked into the dynamic, holding the dynamic, as a point of interest. Yeah.
Yes.
definitely difficult at home, I think, with partners, you know, maybe in the workplace it might be. Yeah. Anna, you were going to ask something.
So I love the idea of the quality of the relationship is of ultimate importance. And yet then I'm thinking about organisations where there's a 360 process in place and they can't afford for everybody to have a nice facilitator to facilitate everyone else's feedback. So a machine does it, like we all know about, which is great, but no facilitator to make that process more meaningful. And maybe the person that could help with that is a line manager. And we all know that not all line managers are up to the job, or the relationship, the connection's not strong enough. So is there anything from this that you think is useful for those scenarios where, for one reason or another, there's an absence of a connection, a strong relationship to facilitate 360 feedback?
Not really, to be honest, because but damn, and I guess I love AI in many contexts, but the human touch, I mean, I guess that is what we're talking about, really human dynamics. I protect myself because I'm human. If I was an AI, if I'm just a bot, then I've got no need to do that. So I think it reminds us of the fact that we are irreplaceable actually as humans, because humans do something different to what machines can do. And machines can go so far in helping people understand 360. But I don't think you can shortcut the fact that in a really supportive relationship, both parties learn more, just because we're human. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's something about the energy that's embodied that a machine can't embody. Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, that's okay. No, I was just thinking out of interest, with the different defence mechanisms, are they kind of like a coping strategy for the individual? And does somebody tend to have one stronger defence mechanism, do you find, with each individual?
So they're differentiated from coping strategies in the sense that a coping strategy is a conscious thing that you would do, like whatever that might be, whatever, for me to unwind, I need to go for a walk and have a bath, or, that's a coping strategy. These are kicking in at an unconscious level is the point of them, really. But yes, to your point, I think some of us, I mean, clearly I've just spent 7 years intellectualizing the pain of the end of my marriage. So I think I can safely say that that's one of mine, I think, and denial. I was very good at denying what was going on. So yeah, I think it's really, and partly I really hope to help people start to become more aware of what their own go-to defences are. Yeah, exactly.
Would you say to somebody, I think that the reason you're responding like that is potentially being overcritical of yourself, and would you kind of face into that with the individual in that conversation?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think, and I should have perhaps said when I presented that framework, there is nothing, I think, that makes people feel more defensive than saying you're being defensive. So you have to be really careful, I think. You have to be, it's not a framework that I would sit down with someone and use as such. It's more of a mental, yeah, exactly, or a lot of three in there. It's more of a mental, it's more of a conceptualization of these things as existing rather than the sort of blanket term of defensiveness. Yeah. But equally, I do think I'd like to develop a sort of intrapersonal tool of it, because you could start to spot for yourself, when given feedback, do I tend to always make excuses? So you could notice that, couldn't you? And then be a bit curious about it, because defense mechanisms are mobilized in anxiety-provoking situations, and feedback is anxiety-provoking. So it's a vehicle that we can use to help us understand more about ourselves, because in other contexts, we're going to use these defenses too, like in our relationships and so forth. So I think it strengthens someone's self-awareness if we become more alert to what are my ones, in a sense. Does that make sense?
Really interesting, totally. Thank you.
I thought of another defence mechanism.
There are lots of them.
So, like a physical defence mechanism, and forgive me if you've covered it, but like I know someone who literally goes more deaf when they're anxious and don't want to hear what I'm processing. So it's literally like, what? And so It's like, so I see that as their defence mechanism, because when they're not anxious, they can hear me better.
Yeah, well, like I say, looking away. I mean, that is the ultimate defence, really. Just don't see it. And these are, you know, the ways in which we turn a blind eye to the things that we don't want to see.
Yeah, people have sometimes have trouble opening their 360 report.
Yeah.
It's like, well, they were never going to open it. You know, they didn't want to open it.
How the time?
Well, I didn't have the time. Yeah, exactly.
That's the best defence mechanism of everything.
Yeah, exactly right.
I'm conscious we've just got a couple of minutes before we close, and obviously we've got people. we can keep talking, Trish. I am really conscious though of people online who I'm really grateful to having been here, and I'm sorry that it was a bit disjointed. We've never done a hybrid before, have we, Alva? I don't know if we will again. Yeah, exactly. Is there anything that you wanted to say, Alva, in closing?
Just thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I feel like I want to pull apart those 8 and actually get clear what can I use when I do my feedback sessions.
Yeah.
Because there's a few more tips there, I'm sure, that I haven't been aware of. There's a few defence mechanisms I wasn't that conscious of, but when you say it, it's like, oh yeah, I could probably have seen that.
Well, Alva, come along to the masterclass. I'm running.
Yeah, has agreed to do a training session for us. So we'll be letting everybody know when that happens. So we'll have some practical sessions and you know about how to put that into practice. Because I think my experience of 360 has been for a long time that my assumption is that every single thing they say to me, the person putting feedback to, is through a filter of defence. And I make that assumption, and if I work with that assumption, then I tread very carefully around it, and I listen really hard, and I work really hard. What are they willing? What's their spring really? What are they willing to hear right now? I don't push it beyond what they're willing to hear. So that totally fits the way I like to work it. That dynamic.
Yeah, I think walking into it, recognising they're going to be anxious.
Yeah, assume
it's
anxiety,
a given.
Assume defence, and then it'll be useful and okay, and you'll get that's the way I do it. But thank you, everybody. But we can continue.
Yeah, it's like a weird experience. We're so used to just switching off on here, aren't we? There are still real people. Thank you.
It's actually going to die in the same.
Thank you so much, everyone online. Like I say, just apologies that I hope it did feel inclusive. We were very grateful for you being here. And yeah, I need to get
Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I need to get better at using.
Thank you so much.
Technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
They're going.
They're going. Okay. My goodness. Right.
As a group,
Yeah.
because something quite interesting.
Oh my
here.
goodness, I have to turn that on.
Wanted to create a feedback culture. You were talking about something similar